Hello everyone, this is William Jenkins of the Department of Geography at York University in Toronto, Canada. And what you are looking at here is the congruous sight of an Irish and American flag fluttering in the breeze on a residential street in Buffalo, New York. You will notice the words of the proclamation of the Irish Republic in the middle of the Irish flag as they were read out by Patrick Pearse on the steps of the General Post Office in Dublin on Easter Monday morning in 1916, at the start of the Rising. The house you see here is in the First Ward neighbourhood, one of the several legacies of the immigration from Ireland to Buffalo in the era of the Great Potato Famine in the late 1840s and early 1850s, which is the focus of today's talk. And before moving on, I would like to thank Dr. Jason King of the Irish Heritage Trust for the invitation to present this lecture to the great Famine Voices Roadshow of 2020 in digital form, since I was unable to cross the border under the present COVID-19 circumstances. I would also like to acknowledge the support of the Irish Heritage Trust for organising this year's Famine Roadshow, as well as that of the National Famine Museum at Strokestown Park, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Government of Ireland through its Emigrant support programme. First of all, it is fair to say that the 150th anniversary of the Irish famine in 1997 inspired a commemorative energy that was truly global in its scale. In my current city of Toronto, the Ireland Park Memorial commemorates the events of the spring and summer of 1847, when almost 40,000 Irish arrived in a city with little more than 20,000 people. In Buffalo, as we can see here, the Irish Famine Memorial was dedicated in August 1997 in a location close to the immigrants' first sites of settlement, located either side of the downtown where the Erie Canal met Buffalo Harbour. Not only were the Irish a prominent force in the construction of the Erie Canal in the 1820s, they also used it to get to Buffalo in the late 1840s and 1850s, when it took approximately 8 days to travel from New York. Others, of course, came through Canada. Here at the memorial, concentric circles of grey flagstones surround a granite standing stone, and at the outer ring, 32 limestone boulders represent Ireland's 32 counties. Now, one of the points I will be making in today's talk is that a sense of Irish identity and Irish cultural awareness has remained strong in Buffalo since the era of the famine migration. And there's a number of ways to illustrate this. Of course, there are annual St. Patrick's Day parades and Irish festivals. There's an Irish centre, an Irish dancing tradition of the first rank, and a Buffalo Irish Times newspaper. But I would like to share with you here two of my cherished possessions from Irish Buffalo, which is my Buffalo Fenians Gaelic football t-shirt and my First Ward sneakers, or runners, as we say in Ireland. The Gaelic team's name recalls, of course, the Fenian invasion of nearby Canada in the summer of 1866, when 1,500 or so men crossed the Niagara River, including members of the 7th Buffalo Regiment of the self-styled Irish Republican Army. The sneakers convey the sense of where Irishness is believed to reside traditionally within Buffalo's history, as my opening slide sought to show, and which I will have more to say about as I go through. Before that, though, an acknowledgement of some scholarship and cultural creativity relating to Buffalo's Irish history. There's my own comparison of Irish immigration to Buffalo and Toronto in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as well as Tim Bowen's history of the First Ward with its evocative image of grain scoopers. There's also Richard Sullivan's series of historical novels set in Buffalo, the first of which chronicles the First Ward in the late 19th century. And finally, a DVD on the ward's history compiled by Buffalo's public broadcasting service channel, WNED-TV, whose cover photo features that other familiar sight of the city's south side, the grain elevator. Now here I want to give everybody, especially those of you unfamiliar to Buffalo, a sense of the wider regional context. So if you are able to follow my cursor from Buffalo over here on the left-hand side, and you follow it through the north central parts of New York State, from Albion to Rochester to Syracuse, eventually over to Utica, and then eventually to the state capital of Albany on the Hudson River. The Hudson, of course, representing the final stage of the journey of much Midwestern grain to the city and port of New York. With this photo, I want to give you a sense of Buffalo's Lake Erie context. And this photograph was taken from the top of City Hall several years ago. The Erie Canal was completed in 1825 and immediately signaled the economic potential of what was then still a very small settlement, originally named New Amsterdam. The Erie Canal in Buffalo terminated around about the intersection of the two expressways you see in the center of the photograph. St. Joseph's Cathedral, completed in 1854, is also seen in the left-hand side of the photo, and its presence in the downtown demonstrated the early social and demographic power of Catholicism in the city. The Irish famine immigration, as we will see, was a large part of this story. Also visible in the photo is the Buffalo River and a number of grain elevators before our eyes are taken into the distance to the seawall and then to the lake. Given this geographical location and the ongoing process of land seeking and colonization in the American West, it is not surprising to learn that Buffalo became the busiest inland port in the United States, if not the world. By the time of the Irish famine immigration, the city was housing more than 40,000 people. Because it was the main passenger and freight link between the Northeast and the Old Northwest, it had a constant flow of travelers, immigrants, and transportation workers between its docks and the rail station. One observer from rural upstate New York, who traveled to Buffalo in 1847, was less than impressed, however. As he put it, probably there is no place in the state where intemperance, gambling, and licentiousness walks so boldly abroad as here. Such words would have scared away only the most puritanical-minded people. As far as the Irish fleeing hunger, disease, evictions were concerned, this growing Great Lakes city was a place of opportunity for steady, if largely seasonal work. In 1848, an Erie Canal improvement project supplemented job opportunities in port-related businesses, and the grain transshipment sector was now revolutionized by Joseph Dart's innovative development of a grain elevator. Dart's idea, developed in 1842, simplified the process of transferring and storing grain from Lake Erie steamboats before that grain was further used locally or shipped further east on Erie Canal barges. For the wealthiest inhabitants of the young city, making fortunes in the growing economy and settling into detached homes in its northern end, Irish females comprised a significant portion of the supply of domestic maids. In general, these famine-era immigrants were entering Buffalo with low levels of education and marketable skills, with the exceptions of their physical strength and mental fortitude. They were also largely Catholic in their faith and invariably fluent English speakers, though the variety of accents from different regions of Ireland made them the frequent object of jokes and caricatures in newspapers and magazines. At the same time, this is not to say that one would not have heard the sound of the Irish language on the streets where Irish households were concentrated. By 1870, immigrants from Ireland were the second largest immigrant group in Buffalo, behind those from the German-speaking states of Central Europe. The Irish-born now made up 10% of the population of a city whose population had grown by more than 75,000 people in a mere 20 years. Two key legacies of the famine immigration then were Irish newcomers forming a key segment of Buffalo's Catholic and working class populations. Another important legacy, of course, was the creation of neighborhoods, particularly in that diagonal corridor following the Erie Canal, the waterfront, and the Buffalo River, snaking away toward the southeast corner of the map. At the eastern terminus of the Main and Hamburg Canal in Ward 2, a pre-famine community of Irish clustered on the city's edge in what became known as the Hydraulics neighborhood, forming the initial congregation of St. Patrick's Parish in 1837. But wherever one went, looking to hear an Irish voice, they were most likely going to be walking on unpaved streets and passing by modest cottage-style housing. As demands for work and shelter grew, as the city's economy continued to expand, so too did its built-up area extend more and more in all directions. This did not come about, however, without periodic episodes of economic and social catastrophe. Although the drama of sick and starving famine arrivals on Toronto's harbourfront in 1847 was not replicated on Buffalo's, the 1849 cholera epidemic exacted a heavy toll on the Irish and German communities of the city. Like most boomtown cities of the period, Buffalo was a public health time bomb, in that there were no adequate water and sanitation services in the late 1840s. The lifestyles, living conditions, and waste removal practices in the low-lying parts of the city inhabited by the Irish seemed to confirm prevailing medical opinion about cholera being caused by the inhalation of bad odors or polluted air. And the Buffalo Board of Health enumerated 877 deaths between the beginning of June and the end of September in 1849. The real cause of the spread of the bacteria, once it arrived in the city, however, was the contamination of domestic water. So those who had departed Ireland for a better life were now faced with the drama of a poorly understood disease in their destination society. But the Famine Irish now had the inspirational figure of Catholic Bishop John Timon to guide them in their American journey. The Pennsylvania-born Timon was a Vincentian and the son of Irish immigrants, and came to Buffalo as its first diocesan bishop in April 1847. He immediately set about building institutions to serve the city's Catholics of largely Irish and German backgrounds. He was, however, acutely aware of the higher levels of poverty experienced by the Irish, and invited the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul to the city from Maryland. The hospital they established in 1848 quickly filled up with cholera cases the following year. The Irish comprised 25% of the city's population, but their share of those cholera deaths of known ethnicity was more than 40%. The role of waterways as transmission channels was not fully appreciated at the time, and as we have seen, the Irish lived within sight of several waterways which were potential sources of contamination. In the case of the Germans, the public wells that dotted their neighbourhood in Ward 4 became contaminated at a later stage. Bishop Timon's parents came from the Northern Irish county of Cavan, but he would quickly become accustomed to accents from the southern part of the homeland, as this map shows here. And the map is derived from a database of 166 individuals whose Irish birthplaces were derived largely from headstones in Holy Cross Cemetery, as well as newspaper obituaries and scrapbooks in the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. The map shows a bias towards the southern province of Munster, and counties Cork, Clare, and Kerry in particular. The most popular names of Irish households I sampled from the 1818 federal census are the following: Ryan, Collins, Griffin, Lynch, Sullivan, Connors, Cronin, Kelly, Mahoney, or as they say in the United States, Mahoney, O'Neill, and Smith. If we were to continue, we would encounter other names such as Donovan and Driscoll, names also typical of southwestern Ireland and County Cork in particular. All in all, however, there can be little doubt about that when immigration from Ireland to Buffalo is considered over the course of the 19th century as a whole, all 32 counties were represented in the city, just as they are at its famine memorial. Neither should it come as a surprise to learn that the boulders at the Irish Famine Memorial are a gift from the city of Cork, through which it is likely a majority of Buffalo's Irish moved as they prepared for the final stage of their departure across the Atlantic from the port of Queenstown, presently known by its Irish name of Cove. As the memorial tablet also mentions, the memorial standing stone is from County Galway in the western province of Connacht, from where many Buffalonians also originated. Here we see more traces of Munster at the site, with the contribution from Limerick County Council, a county whose main city, also called Limerick, was a significant emigration port during and after the famine. On the right, we see reference to the Munster county of Waterford and the town of Skibbereen in County Cork, one of the worst hit famine localities on the island. When we look approximately one generation beyond the era of the famine immigration, some of the points we have already made about the job and neighborhood experiences of the immigrants of the 1840s and 50s become solidified. As the map shows, multi-generational Irish households remain tied to the Erie Canal corridor and the waterfront wards, but most notably, the First Ward. Irish immigrant men were mostly pursuing working class occupations and were especially prominent among the waterfront army of grain scoopers. Irish women, alongside those of German origin, continued to work in the mansion-like homes of the rich in the renumbered 10th Ward of the city, with the tree-lined Delaware Avenue as its main axis. Remittances back to Ireland helped Buffalo Irish families fund the travels of siblings across the Atlantic, forming migration chains that later extended across generations. For American-born sons and daughters, there were some signs of advancement into more skilled occupations, such as policeman, firefighter, carpentry, and teaching. But it was still a solidly working-class population overall, especially in that part of town recognized as the most Irish, the First Ward. If we take a closer look at the First Ward, we see not only a landscape of residential streets and grain elevators, but also the institutions of religion and the state, such as Catholic churches and associational parochial schools for parishes founded under Bishop Timon and his successor, Bishop Stephen Ryan, such as St. Bridget's in 1860 and St. Stephen's in 1875. We also see public schools and a network of waterways and railroads giving shape to everyday life. The waterways inspiring the establishment of rowing clubs with names such as Hibernian and Celtic. And there were also boxing clubs, something that could come in handy in another familiar institution of the neighborhood, namely the saloon. The danger of having so many waterways close to places of residence and work was, however, only too apparent to those who tragically lost loved ones to accidents and sometimes suicides. By 1878, there were 30 elevators in the city, owned by private individuals and railroad companies. The earliest ones were built of wood and were thus susceptible to fire. The dust from the grain also infected workers' lungs causing asthma. Many lives were also lost to tuberculosis and asphyxiation. By the 20th century, the elevators were being constructed from poured concrete and became the object of fascination for visitors such as German architects advancing modernist ideas of building forms in Europe. Here's a photo from some years back of this concrete elevator landscape along the Buffalo River. And yours truly is inside one of them. Clearly, I'm having a ball. Families in this section of the First Ward literally grew up in the shadow of the elevators. In this case, on Kentucky Street. One notable resident of this street at number 92 was Edward Hartnett, who emigrated from Macroom, County Cork. Hartnett worked for 20 years as a scooper and sought a fairer deal for grain scoopers than the contractor system, which benefited saloon keepers and their boss shovelers. This culminated in the strike of 1899 that succeeded in bringing scoopers into a recognized union. Having mentioned the neighborhood saloon, this could be seen as another component of the famine immigration legacy in Buffalo. The consumption of alcohol, and whiskey in particular, was a familiar feature of rural Irish culture at events such as births, marriages, wakes, market days, and seasonal festivals, not to mention the famous emigrant wakes. Public houses were present in even the smallest Irish villages. In Buffalo, the trying conditions of everyday labor on the docks and in the elevators made the saloon a valued site of consumption, camaraderie, and entertainment. It was also a place to sleep, a place to gain knowledge of labor opportunities either locally or elsewhere, a place where grain scoopers would receive their wages minus the amount of their bar tabs. And finally, it was a place to engage in political talk or activity. And politics, in this case, usually related to local party circles, which were more Democrat than they were Republican. And saloons were the location for meetings of campaign clubs and caucuses before the round of elections every November. They could also function as places of drama and trickery on polling day, located as many were to polling stations, close to polling stations. They also gave rise to the success of colourful politicians such as Blue-Eyed Billy Sheehan and Fingy Connors. Beyond this, political chat could also relate to the ongoing politics of the Irish homeland and perhaps some recollection of famine times or the invasion of Canada in 1866. The dense network of First Ward saloons in 1880, particularly on Ohio Street, which I'm going to use the cursor to show you here. This is Ohio Street here, going in a diagonal direction towards the bottom right-hand corner of the map. But it does testify to their ubiquity in this waterfront community. The saloon was also largely a space for men, as this picture of Tom McCormick's saloon on Ganson Street on the south side of the Buffalo River illustrates. In a neighborhood where Bishop Timon's Catholic institution tried to promote principles of devotional religion and principles of temperance, it was not a place for women who typically considered themselves decent would go for a drink. Nonetheless, some saloons were run by widows and their daughters would have tended bar. Many were boarding houses as well. Vice was a reality in some as well, and vice was most infamous on Canal Street, close to the downtown core and chronicled in this book, America's Crossroads. The saloons of Buffalo's waterfront, in the end, by the late 19th century, they had become the bane of city reformers and those who would later lead the charge towards prohibition. Ohio Street, as already mentioned, was the preeminent saloon street in the First Ward, and its boarding houses magnified the floating and transient elements within the local Irish immigrant population. In the table here, we can see how frequent Irish ownership was amongst a minority of Scots and Germans. Boss shovelers recruited labour gangs to scoop grain from the boats, and these were usually single Irishmen who were not long in the city and were not afraid of a drink after 10 to 12 hours of work, to the obvious delight of the profit-minded saloon keeper. One of the establishments included in the previous table is number 170 Ohio Street, still in operation today with the same name and a welcoming neon sign in the window offering free advice to all who enter there. Notice also the length of the building, which illustrates its status as both saloon and boarding house. By the early 20th century, Buffalo's multi-generational Irish community had come a long way from the dramas of famine and cholera. While the First Ward was still the acknowledged immigrant gateway, new generations of Irish Americans were fanning further out to the southern frontier of the city, as well as to quieter and less industry-dominated neighbourhoods on its west side, dubbed as the location for the Lace Curtain Irish. New Catholic parishes were established to reflect these developments, such as Our Lady of Perpetual Help in 1897 in the First Ward, Holy Family in South Buffalo, and Annunciation and Nativity on the west side. As more and more Irish American men and women found white-collar occupations in clerical and legal work, as well as traditionally favoured pensionable jobs as policemen, firefighters, and teachers, so too did they follow church teachings geared towards regular devotions and mass going, socially respectable conduct, and wider held goals such as home ownership. In this capacity, the American-born generations were aided by organizations such as the Irish American Savings and Loan Association, founded in 1884, and which had a membership of 1,200 by 1890. Themes such as social respectability and social uplift map onto the wider issue of adjusting to life in an urban industrial society for immigrants who are used to rural, village, and small town communities in the homeland. We have already noted the role played by the likes of Bishop John Timon and the Sisters of Mercy in aiding the dramas befalling the Irish during the cholera epidemic of 1849. But two things need to be emphasized at this point. First is the role of Timon in inviting religious orders to Buffalo to develop cradle-to-grave infrastructures of Catholic education and welfare in the city, including not only the sick, but also the orphaned. The Sisters of Mercy also managed the two parochial schools in the First Ward, while that of St. Patrick's Parish in the Hydraulics neighbourhood was run by the Franciscan order. Timon also invited the Jesuits and Christian Brothers, who founded high schools, while the Oblate Fathers of Mary Immaculate founded the Holy Angel Seminary on the west side. Timon also established and expanded Holy Cross Cemetery south of Buffalo as the primary final resting place for the city's Catholics. The completion of St. Joseph's Cathedral in 1854 was a high point for Timon. His flock could not now be ignored by the powerful and political interests shaping the city. My second point relates to the role of a small but influential lay middle class in carving out spaces within local media in which Irish and Catholic identities could be sustained in the face of initial hostility and later restrained acceptance by the non-Irish elsewhere in Buffalo. The era of the famine immigration kick-started a new era in Irish American journalism, with titles such as The Irish American from New York and The Boston Pilot growing in circulation in the 1850s and 1860s, followed by The Irish World, also from New York, in the 1870s. In Buffalo, the role of Bishop Timon's successor, Bishop Stephen Ryan, is significant in aiding the emergence of a diocesan weekly newspaper in 1872, titled The Catholic Union. As the example shown here illustrates, it was an Irish ethnic newspaper in all but name, since the German Catholics had their own newspaper, Die Aurora. This front page from 1874 not only has a News from Ireland column, but on this particular occasion, it features an address to the British Parliament by Isaac Butt, the then leader for the movement for Irish self-government. For all of Bishop Ryan's organisational and financial assistance, public face of the local Irish media from the middle of the 1870s onward was Catholic Union editor Reverend Patrick Cronin. Unlike Ryan and Timon, Cronin was part of the famine generation himself, born in rural County Limerick in 1835 and departing Ireland with his family in 1849, having already lost his mother. Cronin was ordained and served as a priest in Missouri before coming to Western New York in 1870. Cronin understood that those who had fled Ireland for the United States had to not only retain their faith, but also cultivate a sense of pride in being Irish. In that context, the pages of the Catholic Union were filled with poetry and stories illuminating the Irish historical past and the romance of the Irish landscape, things that Cronin believed the famine and post-famine generations of immigrants needed education in. Here, for example, we see on another front page the poetry of James Clarence Mangan, as well as the thoughts of 18th century Irish patriot Henry Grattan on the duty of Irishmen to break the chains of Irish slavery. In these respects, Ryan, and especially Cronin, must be given credit for fostering an adult reading public and a sense of ethnic agency among the Irish in the city, many of whom did not enter the United States with literate skills. The Catholic Union made its way to parlors and kitchen tables in Buffalo, Rochester, and other parts of Western New York, and remittance lists for the city, printed on this particular front page, include first ward streets such as Louisiana, Perry, Folsom, Mackinac, Miami, and Mississippi. It should be noted that previous newspapers seeking a primarily Irish audience had previously come and gone in Buffalo. None more blatantly than the short-lived Fenian Volunteer, which declared itself at war with England to the knife. This was a post-Canadian invasion publication, which would not have found favour with Bishop Timon, who denounced Fenianism before his own death in 1867. Within the next decade, however, Reverend Cronin would find space in the pages of the Catholic Union for many rhetorical flourishes about the state of Ireland and the past injustices inflicted on the Irish by Protestants and what he termed English strangers. We should not be surprised then to learn of Cronin's role in spearheading a local committee to receive the bright new hope of Irish nationalist politics, Charles Stewart Parnell, on his North American tour in 1880. The prospect of another famine befalling Ireland hung over the trip. As Parnell told his listeners in Buffalo's Academy of Music, the tragedies of 46, 47, and 48, when over 2 million of starved corpses were flung into coffinless graves, while provisions were exported from the island, enough to feed double the then large population. Cronin remained supportive of Parnell and his dream to reassert political sovereignty in Ireland through the Home Rule campaign, even when it was derailed by Parnell's own political downfall and subsequent death. A Catholic reading public was therefore being developed in Buffalo, in which knowledge and pride in Ireland's history and culture was promoted, along with an awareness of Irish affairs. These also connected with and fed into the shaping of a collective memory relating to Irish nationalism. This process was not unique to Buffalo, of course. Indeed, it was one that spread across the globe to the various destination societies of Irish emigrants. This reading of Irish nationalism was fundamentally anti-colonial, with British misrule as the object of resistance. In this sense, the Republican ideals and life story of United Irishman Robert Emmett intrigued many. Having led a rebellion on the streets of Dublin in 1803, Emmett was executed for treason, but not before he had delivered a speech from the dock where he ordered his epitaph not to be written until Ireland had taken her place among the nations of the earth. At least 3 biographies of Emmett circulated in the United States in the late 1850s. Emmett's story recalled America's own Revolutionary War against England and provided the Irish with another way to reconcile the Irish and American portions of their identities. Many had already fought in the American Civil War, of course. The Irish had therefore proven themselves as loyal and freedom-loving Americans. Symbolic heroes such as Emmett also inspired a sense of future possibilities for Ireland, even if few among Buffalo's Irish seriously entertained the possibility of return migration on a permanent basis. In this context, then, Robert Emmett's birthday on the 3rd of March was commemorated in Buffalo regularly in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Meeting adverts such as this one for the centenary of his failed insurrection graced the pages of the since expanded Catholic Union and Times. 13 years later, in Easter 1916, a rising inspired by Republican principles rocked the streets of Dublin once again, of course, and the executions that followed in its wake created a new series of martyrs who died for Irish freedom to take their place alongside Emmett and others. The feats of this latest cohort of revolutionaries were recognized in Irish Buffalo. Even after America entered World War I, and hyphenated identities were not exactly the order of the day. As the evidence of this petition to President Woodrow Wilson suggests, not least its claim of Ireland being the oldest nation in Europe, Buffalo's Irish-American clergy, who succeeded Reverend Cronin, continued to breathe further life into Irish nationalist identities in the city as Ireland's political history entered a radical phase with the War of Independence. We have covered some ground in this talk, but I would like to bring us into the home straight with some additional evidence from the more recent past of the role of print media and festivals with Irish themes, as well as a reinvigoration of Irish famine memory in Buffalo at a collective level through the completion of the Waterfront Memorial and the annual Famine Mass. This in turn maps onto a sense of the legacy and memory of the 19th century Irish immigrants in the city, people whose lives and experiences I have been concerned with today, and people for whom the meanings attaching to everyday American lives I have tried to illuminate in this brief amount of time. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I hope you remain in good health and stay safe.